Hello, welcome to episode 126 in this series where I'm programming an NES game from scratch. In the last episode, we had a couple of things. In the last episode that I posted was a live stream with Jonathan from Old School Gamers, and thanks to him for coming on and chatting about debugging the NES. That was a really long video, but if you didn't check it out, you definitely should at least watch some of it, because there's some interesting stuff that we talk about with regards to programming and debugging, specifically for the NES. The video before that, we were working on getting these spawn point things to show up, or rather to work in the game, so that we could make our enemies appear and fly down the screen without tying the logic of spawning those enemies to a particular sprite, but rather to these entities here. And then what else? That was really the key focus, and then getting into more about the level design and enemy placement and that kind of stuff. We're at a point where I'm hoping to actually start building some more real levels. I know I've said that, but we start working on that and find new things that are not implemented in the way the maps are loaded, and so we have to kind of cycle back to handling that. Let's see if we can get these spawn points handled properly in the game, and then we'll wrap. We'll try to keep this one relatively short. And then the next one, which will be a live stream on Thursday of this week, we will continue on, and we'll add some new stuff related to the ship movement and animation for the ship movement, and some other details related to how we want to continue building the game. Anyway, let's move right along. And I've mentioned this a few times, but I want to take a quick moment to thank my patrons on Patreon. Definitely appreciate your generosity and support in this, and you can check the description below the video if you want to do that as well, or provide me with a coffee through Buy Me a Coffee. So not required, obviously, but definitely appreciated. So thankfully, in the last time we were working on this, I left a little note here to help me remember what it was we needed to do, because I did not remember coming back to this after about, I guess, what was it? It's a week. So let's take a look. So we're dealing with these map objects, and we have a flag that sets whether they're visible, and if they're visible or not is determined by the type of object. If you recall, when we were working on this before, created the spawn point, which set the visibility of the object to false, and then that got us into loading the name of the sprite that we wanted it to spawn, a delay value, what else? Yeah, so the delay, the name of the sprite that we want to load, and the number of sprites we want to load. So where is that code? So we have the count and the delay, and if it's visible. And then I know we added something for the sprite itself. So it's this sprite ID. Maybe let's rename this to spawn sprite ID so that it is clear what that ID is referring to. And so what we need to do then is we need to make sure that we are doing the mapping of the sprite name. Excuse me. Okay, and then this sprite name is the actual name of the thing that we're going to map to the ID. Okay, cool. So we need to make sure that we do that before we go into the export process. So let's handle that here. So we're looping through, we load the project, we're going to get out of this let's see, we get the project files, and that will help us. We loop through the project files to determine if it's a meta tile or a sprite. So let's see. And then we are passing game meta tiles to there. And that comes in through this. And so now we have this load map call, which gives us our map objects, which is what we were looking at a moment ago here. So if we go back to this, what are we doing with these sprites? File exists, get file name, that's loading the meta tile. We're not doing anything with that. I don't actually see. I see us incrementing our sprite ID, but I don't actually see. Let's see, if the project file is a type of sprite, but it's not a sprite file name, then it checks to see if the sprite file actually exists or not. And if it does, it updates the content with the sprite name, but it doesn't actually seem to be. I guess we're just keeping track of position for export ID. Let's see. I forget how this works exactly. map meta tile to file system item. Current file. Right, the current file list is that global thing, and the map meta tiles is what comes out of loading the map. And we're let's see. So it's just looking if there is something that's a meta tile that maps to it or a sprite file, and then assigning the ID to it based on that. I'm not sure this is the most robust way to do it, and then it loads them. What is this? This is meta tile 0. It's hard coding that in, which is fine because we know that that's always going to be blank. All right, so what we then need to do is for map meta tiles, is that defined here in this function? Yeah, so for map meta tiles, we need to know if the name matches and if it's a sprite. And if it's a sprite, then grab the sprite ID for it. And then put that into the map object structure. Wonder if we can do that. Not really processing the map objects here, so but we do have, okay, so but we do have, oh, that's the GID for the the map object gets its GID, I guess, from when the map is loaded. Because, right, we loop through here and we find so this might be where we want to do this. So this is actually, that's interesting. So we do have a way of identifying that it is an object rather than, sorry, this is all kind of coming back to me. That's the thing, when you build these tools kind of from the beginning without a clear idea of how this is all going to fit together, sometimes you miss certain edge cases, or your logic is a little bit fuzzy on how you want to handle things, and so kind of going back to it, you have to recall why it's processing it this way. So what we need to do here is we need to handle the fact that we've introduced this new functionality here for these map objects. this is handling, if we just run this for a second, this is handling how the meta tiles get mapped to, how the meta tiles from the map file, the map project from tiled gets actually mapped out to a meta tile that can be loaded from the file system. That's why we're skipping this here, because those are sprites, they're not meta tiles. We want to, let's take a look at this for a second. So map object gid s map meta tiles I dot gid. So that's our mapping to right. So this is our mapping of if the GID was an object or not. And so the GID of 3 was an object. And so that's why it's 1, which is why we're skipping it and setting this map meta tile to be set to is object. So now what we would want to do, let's take a look, because map objects then so what we would want to do is we'd want to then process the map objects maybe at the end here and see if they're not visible and have a sprite set. And then we have to find the actual sprite. Although I don't recall where we may have that already in memory. Let's get the current sprite. Game meta tiles has, looks like just the actual background meta tiles. Okay. We don't have the objects, the sprites yet, but they're, or in that list. It should be loaded somewhere, though. I know there's this whole process where we were doing that. I just got to find where they live. Unless they're in the current file list and we're just iterating through them, I don't remember. Yeah. So we are so we're just iterating through the entity list and finding all the ones that are sprites and then exporting those specifically. So given that, how or Y. What are we writing here? Are these... Am I looking at the wrong thing to write? This is the map file, but this map object count should be... Let's take a look here. Map file is greater than 0. Map object count is 2. Alright, so doing it where I wanted to do it later on is going to be too late, because when we're dealing with, and that makes sense. So when we're dealing with the map and writing up the map data, we're handling just the map related sprite data, so we haven't done anything with processing the sprites, or we wouldn't be able to do any pre-processing to do those ID matches. So let's take care of that here. So same thing as we're doing in other spots where we're iterating through everything and checking if it's a sprite. And if we were caring about the efficiency of this, which I mean, I sort of do, it bothers me that we're doing this, but at the same point, it's not the critical, it's not a timing critical thing in our pipeline here. It's lazy at best. We got to look at the sprites here. Excuse me, and we have to. Wonder if it's simple enough to just create a. Sorry, I'm just thinking through this. So maybe we should just create a list of sprites based on the order they appear in the current file list, separate from the file list, so that we can skip reprocessing things that are not sprites. Would we be able to get a lookup that would work by name? That would be more efficient. Probably not. This is where using something like some of the standard C++ things for maps and tuples would be helpful. Not necessarily from a efficiency of code perspective, but more so from ease of writing. You know, a map, and this way we don't have to write our own hash for the names, so that we could do some sort of better approach than just looping through every single one of the map objects to match them up with sprites. Let's do this. We want to loop through the map object count. We're going to have yet another nested loop in here. This will be and what we'll do maybe in the next session is, or depending on how far we get tonight, maybe what we'll do is we'll do some optimization of this stuff, and we'll start ripping out all of these redundant loops, and these loops we'll start using some more efficient structures to handle some of these lookups we're doing, because we're spending a lot of time looping through things to compare items for no reason, and it is bothering me. But at the same time, we can make progress without necessarily caring about those. So let's see. So what we want to do is, if map objects I, so if it's not visible, and so if it's not visible, and the first character is the null, which means it's an empty string, then what we want to do is well, actually, we want the opposite, right? So if it's visible, or this isn't, this is 0. This should have been not 0, but I messed up that condition. We'll just we'll say continue. We don't care about this. If the sprite name is empty or it's visible, then continue. Otherwise, we want to go through, and if it's a sprite, then how are we? So we're actually then just loading the sprite. Okay, so current file list J. That can't be right. There's where is our loop? Where are we handling the, or are we not? Are we not? Do we not actually care what the sprite IDs are? All of this stuff is handling the sprites purely based on we got to include some files around them. But I thought we cared about the ID of the sprite, so that part I'm a little confused by right now. Current sprite loads the sprite. I mean, if we look at the sprites, we know there is an export ID here. Let me see something. Part of something I've been thinking about doing with this, because it's really difficult to step away from the code for such long periods of time and come back to it and then spend a lot of time trying to remember what I did. Part of what I'm thinking about doing is doing a number of sessions of programming sequentially and just releasing them one after the other. I wonder what your thoughts are on that, if you have any thoughts, but Only because it would probably be more efficient for me to do that, and then I could build up a backlog of episodes to post, and then I could work more on 0 pages episodes, and finally it would probably make these individual episodes just way more productive and cohesive. So map meta tiles, map objects. What's game meta tiles? Is that all of them? No. Somewhere, somehow, I'm handling the sprites and doing the mapping. You know what? No, I'm not. That's where my confusion is coming in, I guess. If the map isn't using the sprite, then it doesn't exist in any of the structures. Okay, that makes sense. That's where my confusion is coming in. So the reason that this works okay as is because if a sprite is placed on the map, it gets a GID from tiled, and then we do the mapping that we need to know that, okay, if this is the GID of the object, this is the sprite that it corresponds to in our sprite list, and we do all sorts of tricks and whatever to make sure that the object that we're dealing with gets placed onto into the data properly, so that when we hit the object in the map as we're scrolling up, we can spawn it correctly. That only applies to sprites that are placed on the map, right? So if it's a sprite that gets loaded through this, because we have some additional sprites that we reference that are not, they're not in the map, but they are nonetheless used, we are not processing those in the same way. We are processing them to make sure that they get added to our entities list. We're processing it to make sure that they get added to our draw entities routine, but they're not as such in here. So what it looks like happened really is I should have added the things that I added to... Oh no, okay, no, that's fine. So the map objects have what they're supposed to have. The challenge is that we don't know, we don't have a list of all of the possible sprites. We only know about the sprites that come from the map. And okay, right, and then that's why we're doing this. It's because we're iterating through... Okay, so this is all making sense again now. So we're iterating through the list of all the working files in the project file, so that if something is a sprite, from the project file, we increment the next ID of the sprite so that it doesn't collide with one of these. But the flip side to that is that we never actually do any sort of assignment or anything to these files. They're not treated in the same way as the map related files, and so there's no way to map this to something in the map itself. So what we need to do So what we need to do is we need to have some way of identifying either the list of sprites and their IDs, which we could do that. That would work. Trying to think. And that would be all the sprites. That would be the sprites that are loaded here. Actually, I take that back. It wouldn't be all the sprites. It would be the additionally loaded sprites, the non-map specific sprites. So we'd need to know a list of those and what ID they were assigned, essentially, so that we could then look that up and embed that in the content. So there's a couple of ways we could do that. We could do that by just putting it into this current file list as additional data about the thing, right? We have this file system item. I don't want to do that though, because that is a pretty high level item, and it was meant for specifically handling file system content, not sprite content. So what we probably want to do is create another list of map objects that we can pass in that will be used for this export process. And we can, let's see, I think it's called map object, right? So we'll call this external sprites, and we'll give it some fixed value. Okay, so we initialize that to 0, and as we get through here, we're going to say for, I mean, that sprite ID is just going to increment 1 by 1, so sprite ID is probably, we could say the index is the sprite ID. Do we want to use map object? Now the problem with that, it doesn't have the name of the sprite, which we do need to know. We could actually load the sprite itself. Which that doesn't really help us that much. But I think that's probably, well, no, because that doesn't have the ID either. That's just the definition of the sprite structure. So what we can do, we can use that, that's fine. So what I was saying was we can say external sprite, sprite ID, spawn sprite ID, well, let's just say the GID is sprite ID, and then the name is this, but we want the name without the extension. And then, what's the problem with this? Oh, it's sprite. And then we want to get file name without extension. And that's this guy. So we're just taking the name of it, making sure we're getting it without the extension. Putting it into that. That's really all we need of that. So by the end of there, we should have the list of sprites in that external sprites thing. No? Try again. Excuse me. Oh. That's no good. I forgot that only happens if it's not already loaded as a sprite. I want to do this here. Okay. Still not working. Sprite ID is 1. Why? Oh, because it's putting it into that one. Didn't have the name. What's the problem with the name? Current file list I. Oh, so this is a bug. That's a bug. That's not supposed to do that. Why does sprite ID start at 1? I don't know. I know why the export ID starts at 1. Okay. That's weird. That should not... If I'm looking at project file... Oh, because... Am I incrementing current item count every time? I am. So let's see here. That's weird. Project files I. If file exists, do memcopy. plus plus current item count. Oh, because it's already been incremented, and it's so this should be. That would be -1. Yeah, so this would have to be -1 because this would be, we're saying, the last thing that we looked at is what we want. All right, so let's take a look here. So that actually has the sprite, has an ID. And the ID is 1 anyway, so we've kind of doubled up on it, but that's fine. So our next sprite is the bullet. Let's this is sprite ID. Okay. This is the player sprite. It's the cloud sprite. Enemy bullet. A little bit. Okay, and then we're done. All right, so that's got our external sprite list then done. Where we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, that's why sprite ID is starts at 1 because sorry, those IDs correlate to the entity types and entity type 0. I should write that down. Because I'm not going to remember again. All right, so we have those. Now we need to be able to pass that through the export process. So let's add that. We added that so that we can pass the sprite size, the sprite list and the maximum number that we're going to actually loop through. Okay, so now we're back to this, and the good news is we just loop through like this, except we start at 1. And if external sprites I GID equals 0, break. Right, so if we hit a GID of 0, then we're done because we've hit the end of the list. They're all contiguous. I believe that's correct. Let's double check that statement because That would be bad if my assumption is incorrect there, but yes, the sprites would all be contiguous. So as soon as you hit a GID of 0, you'd be done. Alright, so now that that's set, then what we need to do is for our map objects, we say if it's visible or where the first character is the null, then we skip it because we don't care. The other thing is, well, we actually have the real counts. We don't need to do any tests there like we're doing with the sprites. So now what we want to do is we say, okay, if the map object name and the external sprite name match, then map objects j sprite spawn ID is equal to I. So basically, if we find, you know what, let's not do that, just in case we change this for some reason, just make it actually use the GID. So we're looping through. If the names match, then we have our ID. We do that as many times as we need to for every external sprite and map object, and that would mean that we would exit out of here with our map objects having that mapping done properly. So let's step through that process, and not through the whole process, just get to that point in the code to look at our map objects. And we have a GID, it's false, that's a little bit cool. So that looks good. If we go to map objects 1, there are only the 2 there, they should have the same values. Wait a minute. Wait a minute, that's not right. Spawn sprite ID is 6, which that sounds right. It is. So why is only the first one set? So for each sprite, go through all the map objects. This one says it's visible. Why do you say you're visible? That's not correct. How is that possible with everything else being set properly? Oh, well, because I is probably the wrong index to be using. What index are we using? Loops through the layer count. If it finds an object group, it looks for the objects. Oh, I see. No, so that is right, but why... Oh, this is wrong. That's it's weird that I did that. It was only ever setting the first one to be visible. Probably just being tired. So this should be set correctly now. Yep. Okay, so it's not visible, and spawn sprite ID is 6, which is good. That's what we want. So now what we need to do is in here, we want to write our single byte that says if it's visible or not. So that's that. And then if it isn't visible, well, no. I think we should probably write all the values every time, just for consistency. Sprite type, the count, and the delay. So that's the spawn sprite ID, the count, and the delay. And the delay is 2 bytes. Is that right? Is that how we did it in the code? I don't remember. Looks like timer is just a... it's just a byte. Let's change this to be a byte as well. This needs to be converted to 50 or 60 frame counts approximately. Well, so if we're... yeah, that's true. If it's... Let's just force this. So we're dividing by 60. I forget. This is delay in milliseconds, so this isn't exactly right either. It's the other way. I want to divide by 1,000. I want to multiply by 60 and then divide by 1,000. The reason I want to do that is because, in that order, is because if I don't, with this being a non-fractional number, what will happen is if we divide by 1,000, we lose. Let's say if this was a little bit more of a subtle number. So for 1,000, it's not that big a deal. You end up with 60, right? Because you get 1,000 divided by 1,000 times 60, 60 frames. But if it were, let's say, 1,500, and you divide by 1,000, you lose that. So what you need to do is you need to do the multiplication first. And you get 90 frames. That's a simple little thing that's easy to overlook. Run into that problem with a lot of developers before, where they don't realize that the truncation affects what they're doing, and so they don't do the multiply before the divide, and then they keep getting the same value, or they get weird behavior that's not what they expect. And as a result, they end up with a value that is problematic at runtime, and they can't figure out why. So if we look at what we're writing here now, we've added, if it's visible, what the spawn sprite ID is and how many we want, and the delay. So that one's 500, that one's 1,000. But that's good because that tested it out, right? So we got 30 frames. Let's okay. So we're going to get 60 for this, and that works. So those are our map objects. For other map objects where they're visible and they have delays of 0, we'll still get 0, and all that stuff will be normal for them. But we've effectively changed the way we write our map data out, so that now the map data is storing this additional information we're going to need for these spawn points. Now, one of the things that we had done in our discussions about how sprites are rendered in the game is we had changed how this draw entities code had worked. And in order to test the way that this export is working now and adjust the assembly code, we're going to need to fix the way the draw entities code is generated here. And I don't have the energy or capacity to do so tonight. So let's wrap it up at an hour. We'll come back to this and fix the draw entities generation. If we run this to completion, the good news is that we should be able to, using kdiff3, very easily see, if I can get to the folder, what the difference is. So if we go to draw entities here, and then we go to our assets and our export, and we have draw entities there. We will see the problems that we have in our code that's been exported. So for example, that looks like that's a bug in the way it's generating. Oh no, we had split the types, so we never fixed that. So there's the no longer just the entity type. There's a projectile type and an object type, I believe it's called. Or no, it's just entity and projectile. So that needs to be changed. And then there's this additional code that we're doing here for the sprite flicker. We also changed the U-bound definition, so we'll come back to that next time. Sorry, the last few episodes of me programming have been relatively short because I have been having quite a bit to do at work and waking up early, and just it's been a little difficult to focus on this. So let me know what you think about what I said in the beginning of the episode. Do you like the idea of me doing a series of episodes batched together where I'm just sort of day after day doing them, and then I'll drop them spaced out so that you're not getting, 6 or 7 new episodes to watch at a time. How does that complicate streaming? Well, it complicates streaming because then I can't work on the stuff that I can't really work on the stuff that you haven't seen then, but at the same time, the streaming seems like fewer people are joining that. So I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on the streams. Also, if we want to do more of a Q&A style episode there or what. But as always, thank you for watching. If you want to reach me on Twitter, I'm at Clairvis. I'm on Nintendo Age as Zelius, and you can find me through my email, zelius@gmail.com. Feel free to comment on the video below on YouTube, and I will see you Thursday. Have a good night.